بینەرانی عزیز دووبارە سڵاوتان لەبێت. Welcome again.
Thank you.
We will continue our discussion about dictatorship,
Sure.
or the concept of dictatorship. Your last statement was that if President Barzani wants to know about dictatorship, he must look at the mirror. What do you mean by this?
What I mean is that there must be accountability in a democracy. There must be a priority that your legitimacy comes from the people, not from your family. There's got to be a sense...
Well, sorry for interrupting you.
Yes.
His legitimacy comes from people because there were so many elections from the 1990s and he got 70 out of all the voters. 70
Yes.
percentage of Kurdistan voted for him to be president of Kurdistan regional government. So
how many people voted for Ben Ali? How many people voted for Hosni Mubarak? We have to have a fundamental question, not just about the day you go to the ballot, but whether in the 6 months before then, opposition parties were free to campaign everywhere, not just in Sulaymaniyah, but everywhere going up to through Haller into into Zakho, Ahmadiyya, into Barzan itself, and so forth. You also have to ask whether legitimacy is coming just from the ballot box or whether legitimacy is coming from intimidation from party militias and so forth. This was ultimately a lesson which is experienced in Palestine, it's experienced in Lebanon, where you've had Hamas, you've had Hezbollah, each with their militia, which has interfered, and it comes, and this is why the free press is so important. It's come in the past from attempts by the state to control the press, to take revenge against television stations, and certainly NRT knows this best, which aren't hewing the party line. And ultimately, this is why when it comes to elections, it's not, and the international community will say it's not enough just to have short-term observers, not enough to have foreigners who come for 3 days and watch the ballot. Ultimately, they've got to be here for months ahead of time so that they can make sure that there truly will be free elections.
Right. Let me quote from one of your articles.
Okay.
In one of your articles, you said Kurdistan has European cars, discos, hotels, and restaurants, but the hospitals and schools of Africa.
I was actually quoting a Kurdish friend of mine who had recently returned to Kurdistan for the first time in years. He had seen what had impressed him, the shiny...
So you are backing his opinion by quoting from his speech?
What I'm doing is highlighting the problem.
Yeah, right.
That there has been uneven development, that ultimately better care needs to be taken with regard to the infrastructure. Kurdistan can become a first world country, but it's not enough just to have luxury cars and these new restaurants. That's great. But ultimately, there's a real problem in the medical sector. There's some problems with regard to education. Now, one of the things which has most frustrated me is having friends who are doctors, who work in NGOs, medical NGOs. They don't seek to see a profit. They don't seek to actually take any money from anyone in Iraq or in Iraqi Kurdistan. They could not get their phone calls returned from the Kurdistan Regional Government Office in Washington because they weren't doing business in a way that benefited the profits of specific people. So what did they do with the free medical equipment? They went to Basra.
Right.
And that's a tragedy for Kurdistan.
So what corruption has to do with this? Is it the corruption and the abuse of power?
Well, ultimately, what the article you're quoting about was another issue of infrastructure, why it is that Kurdistan doesn't have modern banking.
Right.
Kurdistan was actually offered for free to have electronic banking centers, more than 1,500
Till now we are
of them.
dealing with cash.
Exactly. And the root of this has to do with corruption. Oftentimes people will add to the payrolls of various ministries with families, with friends, and so forth. They may not actually go to work, they may not do much of a job, but they will still collect their pay. They'll line up at the office, and let's say their pay is, just for the sake of argument, $200. Well, when they line up to the office, while their salary is $200, they only take $150 and that $50 goes to somewhere else. But if you have electronic banking, where the salary is distributed directly into your bank account, then you can't have party officials inflate the bureaucracy and steal that money. If you had a salary of $200, you would get $200.
Right. So, speaking about corruption, the Kurdish officials always declare and confess that there is the problem of corruption. But why they can't eliminate it?
Well, this is actually a very good question. First of all, I think it's positive that finally they acknowledge it. Because when we first started writing about it, and I say we because it wasn't just me, there was a whole generation of Kurdish journalists who were doing it. They were denying that corruption really existed. Now they have no choice. But one thing I would like is this. I can only think of one country which has ever defeated systematic corruption, and that's the Republic of Georgia. You know that in Georgia, every single police station by law has to be built where all four walls are made out of windows so that everyone can see what's going on in the police station at every time. Why is it that the Kurdistan Regional Government is afraid to have parliamentarians from Georgia come here to give public seminars on how it was that Georgia was able to eliminate corruption? It's an easy system. You learn from experience. Right. Why is it that the KRG is afraid to do this?
So they are preventing them from coming to Kurdistan?
No, but I mean, they know the example of the Georgians. Certainly, let me put it this way as a challenge. Why don't they, over the next year, invite parliamentarians to come? Instead of simply inviting retired American generals to come, go to Erbil, go to Saridash, come to Soleimania, eat lots of mazguf, and then go home. Why not bring others who can address some of the contemporary problems in Kurdistan?
Yeah, right. Before moving to the situation in Syria and
right.
what happens in Turkey, I want to speak about the democracy in Kurdistan. I'll quote again from one of your articles. You said that the Kurdish officials often describe Iraqi Kurdistan region as a democracy. What do you think about the democracy in Kurdistan? Well, do we have something called democracy in Kurdistan?
It's a democracy of rhetoric, not of reality. And ultimately, the outside world has woken up to this because of the overreaction, especially in Erbil. The kidnapping of people like Kamal Syed Qadir, the assassination of journalists, the burning of political party headquarters, the Yekurtuz headquarters in Duhok, and so forth. All of this has meant that the outside world now understands that there are real problems in Kurdistan. You know, I'll read the Kurdistan Regional Presidency and Kurdistan Regional Government's webpage. And oftentimes when American senators, for example, Senator Joe Lieberman and Senator McCain, come, the KRG website will talk and they will selectively quote from the American senators about all the progress in democracy in Kurdistan. I know the people who traveled with them. I know the people that wrote their speeches, and what the KRG is leaving out is the fact that they chastise the free press.
So even the senators are saying something different from what they are quoting in the official websites?
Yes, and one of the biggest mistakes which the Kurdistan Regional Government has made in recent years is when Masoud Barzani came to Washington, he brought with him Nechiran Barzani and Masroor Barzani to the White House. Nechiran Barzani wasn't yet prime minister again. Barham Saleh was prime minister, and that reinforced a very negative image in the White House and in Congress about what Kurdistan really stood for. People don't think after that that it's a democracy. They see it as a mafia state, a family state.
Yeah, but why the American administration welcomed and greeted them?
Well, ultimately, diplomacy is diplomacy. They are, as you said...
So Americans deal with their interests, you mean?
Yes, the Americans will deal with their interests, but at the same time, the Americans will also agitate for reform. Would it be good for Kurdistan? And this is a question which is worthy of a discussion.
Yeah.
Would it be good for Kurdistan if, because Kurdistan doesn't yet have a fully free press? I mean, people attack the press, that's what I mean. Or Kurdistan has problems in its democracy if the United States just turned its back on Kurdistan? I think that too would be a disaster. We don't need another 1975.
Right. But you said that in the official websites in Kurdistan, they are quoting something selectively. Right.
Yes.
This is the word. Why they don't correct it in America or in, for example, President Obama? Why he's not going to speak frankly about what's happening in Kurdistan in order to for the people to know about the real situation in Kurdistan?
Well, frankly,
why they are letting them to do so?
Ultimately, it's because America is distracted by other problems. But let me give you an example of where America did correct a misstatement. Back during the last elections, Qubad Talabani, as the head of the Kurdistan Regional Government Office in Washington, released a statement that the elections in Kurdistan were going to be monitored by various groups.
Yeah.
Now, some of these groups weren't actually monitoring the elections. And the International Republican Institute, which Qubad Talabani said was in Kurdistan to monitor the elections, actually sent out a press release saying that Qubad Talabani's statement was wrong. And Qubad Talabani then very quietly corrected his statement. But ultimately, the reason why America doesn't correct this is because, frankly, no one reads the Kurdistan Regional Government website.
Right. Well, have you met Muqtada al-Sadr?
I have not.
You have not?
No.
And with the...
This trip I met with Prime Minister Maliki.
Yeah. So what do you think about the policy that they do in their work is regarding Kurdistan, I mean?
Muqtada al-Sadr or?
Muqtada al-Sadr and al-Maliki.
Okay, well, first of all, let's start with al-Maliki.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think that Prime Minister Maliki and Masoud Barzani actually secretly like each other. And the reason is this. Because I don't want to sound like too much of a conspiracy theorist here, but the more Prime Minister Maliki will criticize Barzani, the more he gets stronger among the Arab nationalists in not just Baghdad, but elsewhere. Again, like I said before, he's gaining strength. He's winning over some of the people from Ayad Alawi's list. He's winning over some of Muqtada Sadr's list. There's a lot of anger in Baghdad.
So he's playing a game.
He's playing a game, and Barzani's playing a game. Let me ask you this. Barzani will oftentimes talk and warn about Maliki's intentions. This came to a height in recent weeks with the visit by Maliki to Russia to purchase arms. And certainly, Masoud Barzani has criticized the fact that he did that in Erbil. But why is it? Hushar Zabari went with Maliki to Moscow. The Minister of Trade, who's also Kurdish, went to Moscow. Why is it that the KDP delegation, Masoud Barzani's own uncle, the foreign minister, didn't say anything condemning the arms sale from Moscow? The fact of the matter is, I sometimes question whether Masoud Barzani is really a Kurdish nationalist, because what he says in Erbil, with all the nationalist rhetoric, is very different from what he says in Baghdad or he says in Washington. Why isn't it that Masoud Barzani, for example, has never called for an end formally to the occupation of Kurdistan by Turkish troops?
Yeah, I'll come to this. I'll come to this. Well, do you think that Kurds must be afraid of purchasing arms by Maliki from Russia and other countries?
Given Kurdish history, they have every right to be afraid. And the Kurds and the Kurdistan Regional Government should exist to represent Kurdish interests.
And do the Kurds have the right to purchase arms from other countries?
That is a question which I would have to leave to the, simply put, legally, when it comes to the Iraqi constitution, I don't know the answer to that. That's one of those questions where I'm going to go back and look it up because I simply don't know.
Right. Yeah, thanks. So, coming to Muqtada al-Sadr.
Yes.
Do you think that their popularity in Iraq is...
Muqtada al-Sadr's popularity very much is in decline. It's the biggest difference that I see.
What is the reason that their popularity is in decline?
This is easy. Because of the Tariq al-Hashimi case and because of Muqtada al-Sadr siding with Barzani. What's happening, Muqtada al-Sadr's control over his movement was never very strong. It was always a very fractious movement. But now people are saying, you used to say that you were defending the Shiites. And yet now, forget about Barzani. Tariq al-Hashimi, whether you like Maliki or not, he was a killer. He was a Ba'athist. Rather than say, Maliki is doing this for sectarian reasons, that doesn't make Tariq al-Hashimi innocent. Rather, what I would like to say is much more productive. Tariq al-Hashimi did run death squads. Well, let's go after the other people that ran death squads. Muqtada al-Sadr, Masroor Barzani, all of them should face justice one day.
All of them?
All of them.
Why?
Because if they are found guilty, if there is evidence, and I say if, that they have been involved in deliberate murder of political opponents and journalists, then they should face the law just like everyone else, just like hopefully one day Tariq al-Hashimi will.
And Jalal Talabani did the same thing.
Ultimately, that's going to be a question which a lot of people need to ask of Jalal Talabani. I'm not here to defend Jalal Talabani or someone else, but this goes back to what
I remember one thing. When the newspapers and magazines translate your articles,
yes,
among people they said, well, this person, I'm sorry for being frank with you.
Yes.
They said that this person, they are paying for this person in order to speak about Masoud al-Barzani, Nechivan al-Barzani, and the Barzani family. What's your answer?
That's absolute nonsense. First of all, I mean, I have several different jobs. One of my jobs is with the American Enterprise Institute. Another one of my jobs is teaching classes in the U.S. military, for which I still have an active military ID and for which I still have a security clearance. The fact of the matter is, to have this sort of security clearance, you are investigated, your finances are investigated all the time. The fact of the matter is, I would lose my job in an instant if I ever took money from any foreign government or frankly from any foreign political party. And I don't take money from any political party in the United States. One of the reasons I would argue why the Kurds are so frustrated, and the Barzani family especially.
Especially in the Barzani family. For example, we can't find 2 or 3 of your articles regarding Jalal Talabani and his family, but we can find more than 10 or 20 of your articles regarding Barzani family. What is the reason?
I'll tell you the reason right now.
Is it personal or?
No, it's not personal.
Because they said that it's personal,
no.
And you were in the past in Kurdistan, and what happened that you hate them or things like this.
I don't hate them. I have no reason to hate them. This is the issue. It's a matter of principle. Several members of Masoud Barzani's family, well, I'll answer your question directly, but let me put it this way.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why they are frustrated with me, one of the reasons why they will spread rumors, is when someone in Kurdistan writes something critical, even if critical and fair, they may go after their business or they may threaten them physically. I do no business, so they cannot threaten my business nor a family business because I'm not a businessman. And they can't go after me personally because frankly, I have an American passport. And so they don't know what to do about that. That's why they spread rumors. Now,
and this is the reason that you can visit Kurdistan freely without any...
Yes, of course. And I haven't come for the last year and a half because my wife became pregnant and we had a baby girl.
Yeah.
And so I had to take care of that. I mean, family will come first. But,
sure.
But, have I written more about Barzani? The answer to that is yes. And let me tell you the answer why. When someone reads an article I write and their response is to threaten me or to write a letter to my boss and urge that I be fired, as members of the Barzani family have done, then either I can do 2 things. I can be a coward and stop writing, or I can stand on principle and show them that they cannot intimidate me. And that's what I have done.
Right. Well, we have about 10 minutes till the end of the interview. Let us speak about what is going on in Syria. You know that there are 2 options for what happens in Syria. Whether U.S. administration led the Kurds to rule their land and things like this, or to the what's called the radical Sunnis.
Right.
So, what do you think about this?
I think the United States made a mistake initially by not supporting the Syrian opposition and by not supporting a solution like Operation Provide Comfort in 1991. Now, what we've had among the Syrian opposition is a radicalization. That's why I've recently written, and Syria has changed. That's something policymakers aren't talking about. Even if Bashar al-Assad dies tomorrow, Syria today is never going to be like it was 18 months ago, 2 years ago, because there's been a great deal of ethnic cleansing and a great deal of sectarian cleansing. Latakia, for example, is basically a state for the Alawis now. The reason there's battles over Homs is because it's the crossroad of Syria. What I would argue is the United States needs to reconsider its policy toward the PKK and towards the PYD for practical, pragmatic reasons. I'm not a Kurd, I'm arguing as an American. The fact of the matter is, the PYD is overwhelmingly popular in Syria among Syrian Kurds and in towns and villages they control. They are doing a fine job of governance. So ultimately, I much rather have the PYD controlling this territory than Al-Qaeda. And I think it's in America's interest. I think it's in Kurdish interests. Kurds can say, well, I'm not approaching this from Kurdish interests. That's fine. I'm an American. But in this case, our interests do coincide, and I think that's important. Something very important happened in Washington. The Mujahideen al-Khalq, which I do personally consider to be a terrorist group, was able to argue in court that it is no longer a terrorist group. This is what I think the PKK needs to do. They need to ask the State Department, we are not attacking civilians, we are not killing Americans, so tell us what if there's precedent for getting off.
Your opinion is that they are not terrorists?
No. My opinion is that the United States needs to define what the PKK must do to get removed from the terrorist list. And if the PKK fulfills that, then we should start dealing with the PKK. The irony is, of course, that Erdogan talks to the PKK. So in that case, why shouldn't America?
Right. So we are still in Syria.
Okay.
Do you think that change is possible?
Yes.
I mean, removing Bashar al-Assad.
I do think change is possible. I'm afraid, though, if the world turns its back, tens of thousands of more people will die. And the nightmare situation is that we could have a situation like Iraq after 1991, where you had an uprising in 14 out of 18 governorates. And the world thought, Saddam, he's gone. But he stayed for another 12 years, and it was a disaster for the Iraqi people, not only Kurds, but also Arabs, Turkmen, and everyone else.
But don't you think that the situation is different in Syria? For example, daily in Syria, we see that 200 to 300 people are killed.
Yes, exactly. Which is why I don't think, what's the solution to that? You're not, I mean...
And the international world is...
What?
The international world, as if they are deaf or something like that.
Well, ultimately...
They are not taking care of anything, even about the children, about the women. There's a disaster happening daily.
I share your frustration. This raises a question. Do you use military force, in which case what you are arguing is you actually have to violate the United Nations because Russia and China are never going to agree. On the other hand, Maliki in Baghdad put forward a Baghdad plan, an Iraqi plan, which says all the neighboring states should negotiate. That sounds good on paper. But in reality, so long as a single neighboring state or regional state, Saudi Arabia, Iran, think they can win this through military force, then they're not going to negotiate sincerely. It really is a tragedy for the Syrian people, and I'm afraid, I say this as an analyst, not as an advocate, I'm afraid that this tragedy is going to continue for months and years to come.
Yeah, right. So because the time is flying, so I have to move from one topic to another. People in Iraq said that what America did in 2003 was an occupation.
Yes.
It was not a freedom process. And you know that Kurds have a different idea about this. Kurds think that is a freedom, and what America did was a great job. Nowadays, we see that there are Turkish army inside Kurdistan.
Yes.
And you know about this.
Yes.
If I can put it in this way, can we call it a Turkish occupation of Kurdistan?
Yes, we can. The Turks occupy parts of Kurdistan, and for that matter, they occupy parts of Iraqi territory in Kurdistan. I would find it ironic if Prime Minister Maliki calls for an end to the Turkish occupation before Masoud Barzani does.
Yeah.
I think the Turks should go. This isn't 1995 anymore.
Yeah. Do you think that it is something possible, or people of Kurdistan have the right to ask them to move from Kurdistan and remove their headquarters and things like this?
Yes, I do think the people of Kurdistan have that right, and they should do so.
Yeah. So, in one of your articles, you said that perhaps one day Kurdish officials' actions might show sincerity. Alas, that day is not now. Why do you think that that day is not now?
What I was referring to is that what the Kurdish politicians say in Kurdistan is often different from what they say in Washington. They can say that they want a Kurdistan state in Erbil, but they can have a referendum. But when they go to Washington, they don't make the same arguments. They talk about oil pipelines, they talk about business with Turkey, they talk about other things, and ultimately what the Americans conclude from that is that the Kurdish politicians are not serious about any of these issues they talk about here.
Yeah, right. So let me ask you some different questions. We are
Sure.
about to finish the interview. What's your opinion about an independent Kurdish state? From now on, in most of the occasions, the Kurdish officials and especially President Barzani said that one day we are going to announce and declare our independent state. Do you think that separating from Iraq for now is something possible?
Today, it's not possible, but the Kurds certainly deserve their independent state, and the possibilities have never been so great, given what's happening in Syria, given, frankly, what's happening in Turkey, and so forth. So ultimately, I do think we're going in that direction. Now, the one problem here is this. Oftentimes, the Kurds have not been unified. Kurdistan is in a rough neighborhood, and if it ever did become independent, it's going to be a landlocked state with neighbors who are hostile to it. Oftentimes, those neighbors may not simply invade. They may bribe, they may cajole, they may try to take advantage from different political parties and different Kurdish leaders. So I suspect what is going to happen is that some Kurdish leaders are suddenly going to become more Turkish than the Turks. Others may become more Iranian than the Iranians. Yeah. And ultimately, this is the problem.
So you mean that they have been divided into two blocks between Turkey and Iran?
Just like in the past, they've been divided into two blocks between different other countries. Now, the point is, until you have unity in Kurdistan, and until Kurdish politicians will say no, nationalism is more important than yet one more Mercedes for me.
Yeah.
Then you're not going to have your state.
Yeah. One more last question. What do you think about the opposition parties in Kurdistan? Briefly. Thank you.
Very briefly.
Yeah.
The opposition parties, it's a good movement, but it's important that they hold true to their principles. The big question will be, if and when they do get in power, are they going to still be subscribing to the principles they put forward, or are they going to fall into the same old pattern that the PUK and the KDP has? Hopefully, the younger generation will pressure for continued change and reform.
Anything you want to add?
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be in Kurdistan.
Thank you very much. Michael, Rۆبن, thank you very much for being in our interview. It's very kind of you to answer all the questions frankly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. بینەرانی عزیز و خۆشەویست بەم شێوەیە بەرنامەی چاوپێکەوتن کۆتایی هات. کاتێکی خۆش.